Okay, let's dive in. When we look at the massive challenges we're facing, the climate crisis, glaring inequality, our social systems just feeling really strained, there's this palpable sense of urgency, isn't there? We need action.
Absolutely. And we have frameworks like Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, that really map out some critical paths forward. They talk about these extraordinary turnarounds, right? Using ambitious policy levers.
Yeah, things like tackling poverty, shifting our energy, changing food systems, addressing inequality, the big external stuff. They give us the what and some ideas on the how through policy.
Exactly. And, that's often where the discussion stays focused on those external levers, the policies, the tech fixes.
Right, but this deep dive, it's looking at a really fascinating companion piece to Earth for All, a paper that asks a crucial question. If those are the levers, well, who are we? Who's supposed to be pulling them?
Precisely. It really shifts the focus inwards. What is it about us as humans that holds us back? But also, what strengths do we have? And crucially, how are our own tendencies, our human frailties, actually baked into the very systems that seem to be failing us?
So the big question becomes, who do we need to become to actually navigate all this?
And that's the heart of the source material we're digging into today, this paper called The System Within, Addressing the Inner Dimensions of Sustainability and Systems Transformation.
The system within, okay.
Yeah. And the authors make a really compelling case. They say, look, Earth for All is vital, but it largely overlooks this critical piece they call the inner dimension.
The inner dimension.
Yeah.
What exactly are we talking about there?
Well, it's not super easy to define neatly, but think of it as everything to do with our minds and hearts, essentially. Cognition, how we think, emotion, how we feel, consciousness, our awareness, and culture, our shared beliefs, our norms, the stories we tell ourselves.
So individual experiences, but also collective stuff, beliefs, social structures.
Exactly. It's that whole complex inner landscape, unconscious processes, relationships, how we make meaning together.
And how does that differ from the outer world?
The outer is the tangible stuff. Landscapes, buildings, technologies are observable behaviors. But the paper really stresses this. The inner and outer are not separate. They're locked in this dynamic dance, constantly shaping each other.
Ah, okay, so they influence each other. And that's why this inner part is so vital for tackling crises like climate change.
That's the argument. Our inner conditions are deeply implicated in creating the problems in the first place. Think about deep cultural narratives like seeing nature just as a resource bank.
Right, or the whole consumer culture thing, driven by certain values.
Exactly. Individualism, political polarization, our biases, the emotions that drive voting patterns, these aren't just side effects. The paper says they're forever present and active, pulling the levers of our outer world.
Wow. So our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, they're actively shaping the physical reality around us.
That's the core insight. And the critical point here is that this inner dimension, it's not just some optional extra for system change. It's fundamental. It's woven into every policy, every institution, every interaction.
So it's like a hidden operating system.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And in systems thinking terms, Donella Meadows' work, the inner dimension is a deep leverage point, a place where a small shift inwardly can ripple out and create massive change in the whole system.
Okay, that makes sense. But you said it's been a blind spot. Why? Why have we overlooked something seemingly so fundamental?
Well, the paper traces some of this back to the thinking that really took hold during the 18th century European Enlightenment.
Ah, the age of reason, science, progress, right?
It
Sounds pretty good.
And it absolutely brought incredible advances. Science, medicine, living standards improved dramatically for many. We can't and shouldn't dismiss that.
But there was a shadow side.
There was. The paper argues this paradigm also embedded a kind of reductionism, seeing the world as just a collection of parts, losing sight of the whole, the interconnectedness. You see it today in how our governments or universities are often siloed, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it also pushed this idea of humans being separate from and dominant over nature.
Francis Bacon's Empire of Man over Creation. That worldview encouraged treating nature as something out there to be controlled and exploited. It fuels this sense of alienation many feel from ourselves, from each other, and from the natural world. We end up chasing narrow self-interests even when our shared house is on fire.
So the very way of thinking that drove material progress also kind of blinded us to the interconnected reality we live in and our role in the problems.
That's the paradox. And related to that was the focus on the material. If you couldn't easily measure something, like, say, happiness or a sense of community, it often got treated as less real, less important. Think Descartes' mind separate from body.
And this gave us a pretty limited view of what it means to be human, too.
It did. The sort of rationalist ideal gave rise to Homo economicus, this idea that we're purely logical decision makers weighing facts. But, I mean, modern psychology, neuroscience, they show us we're driven powerfully by emotions, by these mental shortcuts or biases, by our values, our sense of identity, our core beliefs.
And these inner things don't just react to the world.
They actively shape it. They build the world we inhabit.
So the aha moment here is that the thinking that got us into this mess, this sort of separate, reductionist, purely rational view, it's just not enough to get us out. We need something more whole, more aware of these inner foundations.
That's the essential message from looking at the history.
Okay, so if this inner dimension is so crucial, what are its key parts? The paper breaks it down, you said, into systems of meaning and then inner states, traits, and capacities. Let's start with those systems of meaning.
Right. These are sort of the big frameworks we use to make sense of everything. First up, mindsets, worldviews, paradigms. Einstein had that great quote, right? The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking.
Hits hard. Yeah.
These are seen as really deep leverage points because they're the fundamental lenses we see through, often invisible because they just are our reality. Like how a culture sees nature, is it a nurturing parent or just a machine providing resources? That shapes everything. The dominant modern view, humans separate, nature exploitable.
But can you actually change something that deep, like a whole worldview?
The paper says yes, sometimes crisis accelerates, and I think how COVID maybe made systems thinking a bit more mainstream for a while. But it's tough individually because our beliefs get tangled up with our identity, our emotions. Sometimes, confronting evidence that challenges your view just makes you dig your heels in more.
Ugh, yeah, it's familiar.
It really shows the power of framing, doesn't it? How you tell the story, how you present the data, it can reinforce or challenge these deep paradigms. Think about the carbon footprint idea. Some argue that framing, promoted by fossil fuel interests, shifted focus away from systemic change onto individual guilt.
Ah, interesting. So being aware of the frame is key.
Absolutely. And it's a two-way street. Mindsets shape actions, sure, but actions can also shape mindsets. Like consistently engaging in acts of care for a local place can actually strengthen a mindset of belonging to that place. It creates a feedback loop.
Okay. Next, in systems of meaning, values. Gandhi said, your values become your destiny.
Yeah, values, those deep, often unconscious beliefs steering our choices. Research finds surprisingly consistent categories across cultures, things like valuing universal well-being or tradition or power, achievement.
And the paper highlights a key distinction here.
Yeah.
Intrinsic versus extrinsic values.
Yes. Intrinsic values, things like connection, community, justice, fairness, being close to nature, they tend to correlate with higher personal well-being and more sustainable behaviors. Extrinsic or materialistic values, chasing wealth, status, image, often linked to lower well-being, more consumption, and more ecological harm.
And the problem is, our current global economic system seems to really pump up those extrinsic values, doesn't it?
It really does. And there's some evidence suggesting a global shift towards the extrinsic. Even things like climate anxiety can paradoxically push people towards extrinsic values, maybe as a coping mechanism, a way to feel secure.
So a big challenge for something like Earth for All, which relies on fairness and collective action, is how do you foster a shift back towards shared intrinsic values?
Exactly. The paper suggests things like consciously encouraging intrinsic goals, maybe reducing exposure to purely materialistic messages, think advertising bans and tackling underlying insecurity, strengthening that inner compass. But ultimately, big shifts probably need changes in our dominant stories and the structures around us.
Okay, then there's identity, who we think we are.
Hey.
I like the Thich Nhat Hanh quote you mentioned.
Yeah.
We belong to each other. Every side is our side.
Our sense of self, is it just me or my family, my nation, or maybe all life? That identity strongly predicts our attitudes, including towards sustainability. Historically, the circle of empathy has arguably expanded, but so many barriers to the kinds of turnarounds Earth for All talks about are rooted in these powerful stories of separation, us versus them, humans versus nature. It fuels exploitation, polarization.
And tackling that requires a different story, a different sense of identity.
A much deeper story, yeah. One where humanity is seen as fundamentally interconnected with all life. Concepts like interbeing or the ecological self. And we can learn so much here from cultures that have always held this relational view. Think of African Ubuntu philosophy, I am because we are.
Right, my identity comes from my connection to others.
Exactly. Or indigenous wisdom traditions globally. They offer these incredibly sophisticated, relationship-based ethics centered on respect, reciprocity, responsibility towards nature, sometimes called 4 Rs or 5 Rs. These are profound knowledge systems.
And engaging with these ideas, or even just practices that connect us, can actually change our sense of self.
The evidence suggests so. Practices that foster nature connection or cultivate self-expanding emotions like gratitude, awe, compassion, they seem to broaden our identity, strengthen that feeling of connection, and that directly links to more pro-environmental actions.
Okay, so those are the systems of meaning, mindsets, values, identity. Now let's get into the inner states, traits, and capacities. More psychological stuff.
Right. These are sort of tendencies we all have that can cause problems, but also capacities we can cultivate to help us navigate better. First one, liberating attention and reclaiming agency. Ortega y Gasset. Tell me what you pay attention to, and I will tell you who you are.
Attention seems so basic, but
Yeah.
it directs everything.
It really does. It determines what enters our conscious awareness, what we collectively prioritize. But, our attention is under siege, isn't it? Our evolutionary wiring for survival, combined with powerful market forces, they're constantly hacking our attention systems.
You mean like smartphones, social media feeds?
Exactly. Engineered to capture and monetize our focus. So just when we desperately need to pay attention to our shared world, our attention is fragmented, distracted. This isn't just bad for our individual focus. It harms mental health, relationships, social trust, our connection with nature. And these algorithms, they drive consumption, manipulate politics, spread misinformation, deepen divides.
Wow. So getting a grip on our attention isn't just personal productivity, it's almost a societal necessity.
The paper makes that case strongly. It suggests both policy moves, regulating addictive tech, maybe a right to disconnect, and cultivating individual capacity through practices like mindfulness, which trains awareness and helps us resist manipulation.
Okay, next. Overcoming bias and seeing clearly. That Annis Nin quote is striking. We see the world as we are, not as it is.
Our brains take shortcuts, right? We rely on patterns, which leads to confirmation bias. We tend to notice and favor information that fits what we already believe. It makes it incredibly hard to take in new, especially uncomfortable information.
And societally, that leads to delays, like with climate change.
Yeah, the paper points to the decades-long delay in acting decisively on climate science as partly rooted in these cognitive biases. And bias gets worse under threat or when we face cognitive dissonance that clash between our values and our actions.
So things like climate denial aren't just about disagreeing with facts.
Often it's a psychological defense mechanism. Even what the paper calls climate disavowal, acknowledging the science but downplaying the urgency or implications. It's a kind of soft denial to avoid the discomfort.
What about hope versus realism here? We need hope, right?
Absolutely. Hope is vital for action. But the paper warns against a kind of willful optimism that ignores the scale of the challenge that can be another form of soft denial. Effective action needs clear-eyed realism combined with what Joanna Macy calls active hope. Seeing hope not just as a feeling, but as something you practice, something you do through engagement.
So tackling bias involves self-awareness, learning about these mental traps, and practices that help us see more clearly.
Exactly. Then there's developing sense-making and grasping complexity, Seneca. No man was ever wise by chance.
And the problems we face now are just incredibly complex and interconnected.
Totally. The paper argues that the sheer complexity of the systems described in Earth for All often outstrips our current collective capacity to understand and manage them. These are what are called adaptive challenges. They demand that we learn, unlearn, and actually grow our capacities.
And we can grow these capacities, it's not fixed.
The paper is quite optimistic here. It points to research showing we can develop cognitive, emotional, and relational skills for dealing with complexity. Adults continue to develop psychologically, our brains change with practice, neuroplasticity, and specific inner development programs show results.
What kind of skills?
Things like meta-awareness, being aware of your own thinking processes, cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspectives, hold multiple viewpoints. But it's not just about being more rational. No, the paper highlights that our brains also have this amazing, holistic, intuitive mode. It grasps relationships, sees the bigger picture. But our modern culture often overemphasizes the verbal conceptual mode, breaking things into abstract pieces. Many indigenous teachings and contemplative practices, like meditation, actually cultivate that holistic way of knowing.
Interesting. Okay, next. Activating imagination and unleashing possibility. Shelley called imagination the great instrument of moral good.
Yeah, we often dismiss imagination as just making things up, but it's fundamental. It underpins how we understand reality and how we envision futures. It shapes our beliefs, our identity, our values. It's another valid way of perceiving reality, complementing science and reason.
And it's key for empathy.
Absolutely. What's called moral imagination allows us to step into someone else's shoes or even imagine the perspective of future generations or other species. It expands our circle of care and is crucial for ethical decisions.
And I guess you can't build a better future if you can't even imagine it first.
Precisely. Imagination fuels positive agency. It helps us see the art of the possible before crisis just forces us to react. There are methods that cultivate this, futures methodologies, working with metaphors, myths, immersive storytelling, the arts. They all shape our collective imagination, our values, even our ideas of what's beautiful, like maybe seeing sufficiency or equality as beautiful.
Right. Okay, this next one feels very relevant now. Promoting resilience and mitigating threat response. Maya Angelou. I could be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it.
Climate distress. Eco-anxiety, burnout. These are widespread, especially among young people. And while feeling distress about the state of the world is arguably a healthy response to unhealthy conditions, persistent distress wears us down, harms health, and can actually inhibit constructive action. So resilience is key.
And resilience isn't just bouncing back, is it?
No, it's more about adapting, learning, even maturing through difficult experiences, sometimes called post-traumatic growth, and it can be cultivated. Importantly, acknowledging the distress openly can actually broaden the climate conversation and motivate action, rather than shutting it down.
The paper also mentions the nervous system's threat response. Fight, flight, freeze.
Yes. When we feel threatened, our nervous system kicks in. Fight-flight mode can shut down empathy, fuel polarization, make us lash out. Freeze mode or passivity might be a default when faced with overwhelming, prolonged stress. Agency, the ability to act, sometimes needs to be consciously learned or relearned in those states.
And trauma plays a big role here, too.
Definitely. Individual, collective, intergenerational trauma can leave people or whole groups stuck in these reactive threat patterns. Healing trauma is increasingly seen as essential for building social cohesion and enabling collective action. Otherwise, you get these vicious cycles. Conflict triggers threat responses, which leads to more reactivity, lower well-being, eroded trust.
So building resilience helps break those cycles.
Exactly. It helps counteract avoidance, nurtures connection, helps restore the social fabric amid uncertainty. Though the paper rightly notes, social trust also needs trustworthy institutions and fair economic systems. But individual and community resilience work is crucial.
Okay, finally in this section. Cultivating the heart and embodying connection. Aurelio Peche, Club of Rome founder. The bonds of love make one's life part of a larger continuum.
Yeah, the legacy of the Enlightenment sometimes led us to downplay or distrust qualities of the heart, love, compassion, empathy in serious discussions about policy or systems.
But the paper argues they're crucial.
Absolutely. From evolutionary biology to history, collaboration enabled by these very qualities has been key to human survival and flourishing. They're seen as negentropic forces creating order, connection, coherence out of chaos. What we truly value, what we love, ultimately shapes the world we create.
It even mentions radical love as a political idea.
It does, citing an example from Istanbul. It suggests these qualities can inform political platforms. Research is stronger on things like compassion and empathy. They're linked to pro-social behavior, sharing, stronger belief in our role in the climate crisis, more support for solutions, even overcoming the bystander effect.
And these heart qualities, they can be nurtured.
Yes. Just like they can be undermined by our environment, they can also be cultivated through specific practices. Developing awareness of our own bodies is often foundational. It's hard to feel empathy if you're disconnected from your own feelings. And our social environment is huge. Isolation from others, from nature, is at the core of any crises. Building community bonds, fostering natural connection, these become imperatives.
And this all feeds into emotional intelligence, which seems vital for working together on complex problems.
Hugely vital. For understanding systems where human emotions are major factors, and for collaborating effectively when things get tough.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot on the system within. Mindsets, values, identity, attention, bias, complexity, imagination, resilience, heart. Translating all that into practical action, though, it could seem a bit overwhelming, maybe even fluffy or impossibly huge.
The paper acknowledges that exact tension, the risk of seeming either trivial or wildly utopian. But it encourages thinking programmatically, seeing it as iterative changes where different efforts reinforce each other. And there are already many initiatives trying to put these ideas into practice.
Like what? You mentioned capacity development earlier.
Yes, there's a growing field of leadership and team training that explicitly integrates inner qualities: self-awareness, empathy, systems thinking, emotional intelligence. You have frameworks like the Inner Development Goals, IDGs. They outline 23 skills like being, thinking, relating, collaborating, acting. These are being used in training for civil servants, businesses, even in schools alongside climate literacy.
So, concrete skills training.
Yeah, and the EU has its Green Comp framework for sustainability competencies. There are many others. And specific projects, too, like the Inner Green Deal exploring this within the European Commission, mindfulness-based sustainability training, the Global Compassion Coalition, and work within organizations like the UNDP.
What about working directly on those deep mindsets?
There are methods for that, too. Otto Scharmer's Theory U, for example, is a change process designed to help groups shift from stuck ecosystem patterns towards more aware ecosystem thinking. It involves deep listening, awareness practices, and co-creating solutions.
And moral imaginations.
That's Phoebe Tickle's work. It uses imagination-based exercises to train our imagination muscles, basically, helping people expand their sense of self, feel more kinship, and envision genuinely different life-centric futures. It's about shifting worldviews around what's possible. There are also groups like the Frameworks Institute that help communicators understand how deep narratives and framing shape public understanding and will for change.
And this isn't just individual stuff, right? It connects to societal well-being.
Absolutely. That's where approaches like well-being economics come in, challenging GDP as the main measure of progress and focusing instead on holistic well-being, which includes inner factors like mental health and community connection, alongside outer factors like income and environment.
Like the WEGO countries, Scotland, New Zealand, etc.
Exactly. The Well-Being Economy Alliance, the WEGO governments, they're trying to embed this broader view of prosperity into policy. This could eventually mean more support for interventions that cultivate inner well-being. Bhutan's Gross National Happiness is another famous example, explicitly integrating psychological well-being into national policy, rooted partly in Buddhist philosophy.
Wales has something similar too, right?
The Well-Being of Future Generations Act, yeah. It pushes public bodies to think long-term and holistically, considering psychological factors. They even offer inner development classes for staff.
And there's a historical example too. Folk building.
Yeah, fascinating Nordic concept, linking individual development, Bildung, self-cultivation through education with democratic progress. These widespread, free adult education programs are credited with fostering the civic capacity and high trust that underpins Nordic well-being. The argument is you need inner capacity development in the population for democracy to really thrive.
Wow. And finally, conscious connection, actively working to restore that sense of interconnectedness.
Right, because fragmentation is such a core problem. This involves learning from different ethical frameworks like African Ukama or Ubuntu ethics, which start from relatedness and belonging to a wider community of life, challenging some Eurocentric assumptions.
And projects working against alienation.
Yeah, groups like A Larger Us focus on building belonging, bridging divides, addressing collective trauma, trying to turn breakdown loops into breakthrough loops. Joanna Macy's work that reconnects is another powerful example, using contemplative practices and systems thinking to help people feel their interconnection and respond creatively to crises.
There's research backing this connection idea too.
Yes, collaborations like the Mindfulness Initiative and Lund University's Center for Sustainability Studies frame the climate crisis fundamentally as a relationship crisis, broken connections with self, others, and nature. They recommend mindfulness and compassion training as ways to heal those relationships.
And simply connecting with nature itself helps.
Definitely. Forest schools, nature retreats, even just spending time outdoors, these foster psychological connection. And crucially, the paper highlights the massive foundational contribution of indigenous wisdom. These traditions have modeled sustainable living and challenged extractive mindsets for millennia.
Often influencing Western thought without getting the credit.
Exactly. So engaging respectfully, learning from diverse knowledge systems, moving towards a truly life-centric paradigm while being careful not to just replicate colonial dynamics is essential.
Okay, so bringing this all together, the core message is pretty powerful. Those vital external changes we need the Earth for all turnarounds, They really depend on corresponding inner turnarounds.
Yeah.
We can't separate the system within from the system out there.
Exactly. It's not an either. And the encouraging thing is this understanding seems to be growing. The paper even notes that IPCC reports are starting to talk about inner transitions for sustainability. This isn't just about damage control. It's about unlocking huge potential for human flourishing, for a richer quality of life that isn't just material.
Yeah, the paper suggests maybe the low-hanging fruit of purely material progress is gone. The real potential now lies in improving our inner wealth, our well-being, resilience, connection. Think about how little we invest in mental health, for example, compared to its importance.
It really brings to mind that quote from Buckminster Fuller, something like, "The world might now be too dangerous for anything less than utopia." Navigating what's coming, climate impacts, AI disruption, disinformation, rising authoritarianism, it seems to demand, as the paper says, a revolution in collective inner resource.
Which brings us right back to that core question for all of us listening, for the we. What qualities, what values do you feel you need to embody to navigate this world wisely?
And what stories do we need to start telling ourselves about who we are as a species to actually protect this planet together?
What could our future even look like if we started prioritizing this inner dimension as much as we prioritize the outer?
Yeah, definitely gives you something to think about.